Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management.
GitLab is a single application for the entire software development lifecycle. From project planning and source code management to CI/CD, monitoring, and security, GitLab helps enterprises deliver software to market at new speeds.
Hey everyone, another episode of the New Stack Makers, and today we are talking about DataOps. Now we hear a lot about these types of terms, these portmanteaus, so to speak. DevOps is the original, and now we have new terms to describe the work that people do. Now these terms may seem new and they may seem a little awkward at times, but they are vehicles for helping us understand what is actually happening with the advent of new technology architectures and their impact on teams and individuals. And DataOps is a clear example of that. And so to discuss this topic, I have three guests today who I'm very excited to have join us. Dina Graves Portman, who is Developer Relations Engineer at Google. Hi, Dina. Emilie Schario, Internal Strategy Consultant for Data at GitLab. Hi, Emilie.
Hey, Alex.
And Nicole Schultz, Assistant Director of Engineering at Northwestern Mutual.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, so you heard my little intro there, and so I'm curious from your perspective, what does DataOps mean to you? And why is it relevant now? Perhaps, Emilie, we can start with you.
Thanks, Alex. I think of DataOps as creating a workflow or a way of working as a data team that creates efficiencies and allows you to get more done with the resources you have and in a better, more stable way. I think the reason we hear so many people leaving data as a profession, as a technical profession, is that they are asked to pull these heroics, and the story of, hey, my dashboard broke, or these numbers are wrong, or are just like seem to be the norm everywhere. And DataOps is really about catching those problems. It's about creating a workflow that catches those problems before they make it to your end user. And I think people are feeling the pain.
Yeah, I would say it's taking DevOps strategies and applying them to data. And so at Google, the SRE motto is hope is not a strategy. And so DataOps is taking hope is not a strategy and applying that to data and using all of the different tools that software engineers have been using for years.
Yeah, to take on to that, I would agree with both what Dina and Emilie have said. In my mind, it's kind of just echoing what they said. It's about automating, data collection processes, right? Using those CI/CD and DevOps practices, automating more so you're not reliant on one person doing one certain thing, while still ensuring that you have high data quality with those data collection processes that you're, automating and as you're moving data throughout workflows.
One of my favorite quotes is from Tristan Handy, the CEO of Fishtown Analytics, the makers of dbt, and it's analytics is a subfield of software engineering. And you could think of, that's true of all data. If you think data is a subfield of software engineering, I think Dina put it really beautifully, where it's about taking those best practices and applying them to data.
And so when you think about DevOps, and we've written about DevOps in cloud native technology computing, which is really scalable computing, and it comes back to thinking about how you can deploy application architectures more efficiently, how you can do that through, in many respects, a process that requires you to think continually about updating your service. Now, when you're thinking about that, you think about version control and you think about how DevOps has really progressed this belief system about version control. How does it apply to data? How does version control apply to data now?
Well, it really starts with version control solves the single source of truth problem, because you create your repository where you're storing your code is the place where your code lives. And I think the example is really, how many times have we gotten an Excel spreadsheet or even a sheet, a doc of any kind that's like version number 37, final edited July 20 something, right? You're laughing, Nicole, but isn't it exactly what we see happen?
It's not, I mean, it's excruciating. Like, it hasn't happened to me personally, but I would just die if I had to go through that.
And so, a version control environment in which everyone's working off a single collaborative code repository, that's the first step in making sure everyone's kind of got the same backbone to the work they're doing.
Yeah, I think adding on to that too, when you have everything in version control, then you have the history too, right? So there's more context and background, right? When people are making changes to how data is flowing or ETL processes, et cetera, that's all in the version control, right? You can see history and explanation as to why they're doing that, who did it, when they did it. It's a lot easier to roll back changes because, again, everything's stored in a history somewhere. You're not reliant on one person that knows, how things are set up. Because I've seen that happen where the one person leaves and then, it's much more difficult for the team that's left to manage reports because they don't know how certain Excel sheets were being joined in the past. They don't know how data was really working because that data was all with that one person and nothing was in version control. So the benefit, like Emilie said, is having a single source of truth. And you're reliant on, you can have a team actually manage it as opposed to just one person having it in their head or on their desktop somewhere.
I would say the entire point of DataOps is having reliability, auditability, and reproducibility. And you can't have any of those without version control. And one of the really good things it does is, if a VP or the media or somebody says, we had this data request a year ago, and now we want to know more about it because you're giving us these new numbers and they look really different. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation where digging that up is just so difficult. But if you have the version control, then you can look back and see that this data model was structured in this way at this time, and it included these things, but now we've categorized this slightly differently, and it's really easy to answer those questions.
So when it applies to data, what is the difference though with code versus storing data in a version? I mean, how do you store data, in a version controlled way?
That's a great question. When we talk about version control, it can mean a couple different things when it comes to data. I think usually we're talking about our SQL scripts or, whatever script it is that is doing the ETL. But there are other kinds of version control when it comes to data, because there are data tables, for instance. So I can look back in certain tables and say that on December 31st, 2016, this is what our data looked like. But I can also look at it today and say, these things are really different now. What happened? What changed? Hopefully, if I look at the scripts that were transforming the business logic, then I can understand why they changed.
The other thing I'll add there is, a lot of times the concept of data ops still feels foreign to folks. The term might be new. And version control, in terms of version controlling your code, just like a DevOps workflow, that is where to start. And so this idea of how do you version control your data, there are different tools, different technologies for that, but getting started, version controlling the code that transforms or edits your data or what's driving an analysis, that is exactly where you want to start in adopting data ops.
I would actually say, that is definitely one of the probably the most important thing to do. There's a step right before that, which is just understanding and keeping track of your data requests and the business requirements. So a lot of times, especially with organizations that have really young data professionals, they're answering one-off requests over and over and over and over again. And the idea of creating version control for each and every single one of those requests is very daunting to them. And to prioritize and understand what it is that your organization needs, the very first step that you could do is you could start to keep track of the data requests. And over time, you'll start to see a pattern. Like, we're asking questions about these kinds of entities, these kinds of metrics. And then you can start to develop things that are more self-serve. And if you understand like what the most important kinds of entities are, then you can create the scripts that creates the version controlled tables for those P0 entities. Because you don't want to slow people down, but you want to, like I said, create reliable, auditable, reproducible data. And what that means is allowing people to have the flexibility to work quickly, but keep track of it and ensure that you don't keep repeating yourself. In software engineering, use dry code, don't repeat yourself. And the same principle can be applied to data.
Yeah, I mean, we can disagree, I think, but what I will say is that I think a collaborative environment or like a single source of truth of where you're storing your code is more important than understanding what are the kinds of analyses that are coming in. Because in a lot of ways, the code that you're producing can also answer those questions. So if people want to know, how many new users are signing up every month, well, you might have a ticket that lays out those details, but the SQL that you're writing is also laying out those details and what the criteria are. I'm not a big fan of people who beat the self-documenting code drum, but I do think it's more important to focus on making sure you're working in a single source of truth code repository than it is to get like a log of what requests are or where they're coming from.
So Nicole, I wanted to ask you a question about, the type of tools that you're starting to use and, in your DataOps journey. What are the tools you're using and how are you seeing a shift, if any?
Yeah, so the space I'm in, we're relatively new to the DataOps scene, I would say. So about a year ago, we were kind of tasked with gathering and exposing a lot of data that we have within our CI/CD and DevOps tools at the company. And really, when you think about CI/CD and DevOps and pipelines, there's a ton of data that lives within there. But it's all in separate tools. And we didn't have a way to really aggregate it and show, CI/CD or DevOps maturity at an application level for application teams to look at. So we actually started kind of by just writing our own overnight nightly processes that run. So I manage a team of software engineers. So everything started as we're automating it all. There's none of them will open Excel. So we started just writing nightly scripts that run and collect data from various sources that then put it into Redshift, which is what we use right now for our database table. And then from there, we have various reporting tools that pull from Redshift, read the data, expose it, and different kinds of reports, et cetera. And I guess in terms of tools, we have a couple other teams that have maybe a more sophisticated ETL process we're working with. And actually, we have a couple different teams now that are pulling and interested in this kind of technology data, really, right? To help show application teams, take action on things like security data or improve maturity in their infrastructure or their CI/CD landscape. So we have a couple different teams now that we've been kind of working with to kind of see, okay, what kind of ETL and DataOps processes are you guys following? What are we following? And we're actually working with them to kind of think through, we have a lot of shared data because infrastructure data, security data, it all ties into larger, CI/CD, DevOps maturity. We want application teams to have a full picture of all this data in some fashion. So we've been working with them to kind of try to mature the process, at least in the space that I'm in, to kind of see what overall process to get all this data and read it in and transform it makes sense long term. So we're still kind of in progress there, but we've definitely seen a lot of great action from application teams when we expose all this data that they can actually are taking action on it, like improving their maturity, remediating certain pieces of tech debt, that kind of thing. I think in my mind, another piece of showing that data is also, I think it makes it easier to get some buy-in from different levels of leadership to say, hey, here's this piece of tech debt. We're not mature in this space. We've been wanting to work on this for, how long. When you kind of show it in a more like a reporting mechanism, it's easier, I think, for development teams to get buy-in from their leadership to spend time on some of those tech debt items and actually address things. And we start seeing trend lines, I guess, go down or improve based on what the metric is. But we've seen a really, I guess, big uptick as well from application teams taking action on the data we're exposing, which is cool.
I have a question that perhaps, Dina, you can help answer, and then we'll move into see if anyone else would like to comment. I'm curious about this question about tools and data engineering overall. And at Google, you talk about the auditability, reliability, and reproducibility of your techniques, essentially, right? How do you apply that to the tool? And how do you then think about that in terms of data engineering, in terms of your pipeline, and how you manage that as individually and as a team?
Yeah, I would say there are a lot of different tools that you can use, and also depends on the size of your data. So I'm used to working with very, very large data, and so these concepts are really, really important. If you're talking about like very, very large data and you're trying to do some kind of business transformation on it, if one shard is down, then you might not get any results. The entire thing will fail. And then you could be going days or a week without having that data accessible. And so we would kind of like apply, one of the SRE principles of like error budgeting. Like we wanted to have 98% completion rate. And then we would set these different goals for ourselves. Like our latency at any given time had to be under X hours. We had to have this much uptime. We had to have this much recall. We had to have an accuracy percentage of this much percentage. And it's really the concepts that are more important than the tools. The tooling, each of those metrics could be measured and actioned upon in a variety of different ways. You could write SQL scripts that check them. You can do health checks. You can like Stackdriver has all kinds of tools that allow you to check these different things. You could have dashboards. You could have pipelines where if you took these little health measurements and it fell out of the range that you wanted, then it would send emails and alerts. So I feel like it's the concepts that are more important than the tools, because it's really a matter of measuring it and then triggering the actions.
Right. So it's applying the tools and to the concepts that you're developing, really.
Yeah.
And so let's move into how you all are using DataOps overall. And I'd like to put this in the perspective of actionable data and how that actionable data is becoming increasingly important. Perhaps we can start with you, Emilie, about when you're thinking about actionable data and the impacts on your own IT organization or on GitLab overall. How do you think about that?
Well, if you type into your search engine of choice, GitLab KPI index, you're going to pull up a page in our public-facing GitLab handbook. That's at about.gitlab.com/handbook, where you can see our top 10 business KPIs. You can also see the top, however many for each of the different functions within the org. And you can see, for example, our security team, what are they tracking? And a lot of these KPIs we make public, so you can see the actual numbers underlying them. But really, this is how we're using data. It's a part of our workflows. It's a part of how we're making decisions. And I think the best way to understand how we're doing that is go see for yourself. It's public.
Awesome. Nicole, how about yourself? How is Northwestern Mutual taking that DataOps technique and acting on actionable data?
Yeah, so it's really about making that data visible. As I said before, that was kind of something that we didn't really have. And so we've really been working, within my team and other teams to make all this different kinds of data visible in different types of reports, and also show that data in different ways based on the audience for that report. And we've been able to get a lot of good leadership buy-in and seeing application teams take action on the data, right? Improving their infrastructure maturity, meeting timelines when we want to decommission something or make a change, in infrastructure. We can actually show that data to application teams. They can see what changes they have to make. We can see that they make changes, and then, we can see the trend lines, moving towards migration dates and things that we have. So that's been great to see.
Dina, when you're thinking about actionable data, I'm curious about. So you work at Google and you work in the developer relations group, and and data is such a big part of Google in terms of Google Cloud and its approach. And I'm wanting to get an idea from you about how you are approaching the concepts of data ops and how it applies to different personas, different constituencies. Who are the people who you're interested in talking to when you're thinking about data ops and how it applies to Google?
Well, right now I'm really interested in talking to developers. Google has a team called DORA, which is the DevOps Research Assessment, I think.
Yeah.
And so they have 6 years of research into these metrics that are very much predictive of a successful developer organization. And so what I've been working on in my team is finding ways to automate the collection of these 4 key metrics, which are change failure rate, lead time to change, and things like that. And so far, the research on that has been entirely done on surveys. So it's people's gut feelings of, how often does it fail, or how often do we deploy? And we're looking at finding that data from the systems data itself.
We are actually, I'm looking at the same 4 metrics and trying to later this year, trying to figure out how we can automatically collect that to show, like you said, show that for application teams for where they are in DevOps maturity and that kind of thing.
I think that's awesome. I think that really gets down to one of the big similarities between DataOps and DevOps. So work from home person has handy dandy nifty whiteboard. But if we think of DevOps as that figure 8 that we've all talked about, the most simple way I can think of DataOps is data flows in, you use a DevOps workflow, and then your data analysis or insights or whatever the language you want to use here comes out. And a lot of the infrastructure questions that all teams, data teams have, data quality, data reliability, what testing do we have in place, things like that, come down to a lot of these software development principles like logging and artifact tracking and things like that I think it sounds like Nicole and Dina, you're getting at.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about DORA is that's backed up by 6 years of really intensive research. I can't tell you how many dashboards I've made that nobody has used. And you look at the logs and see, the last somebody used this was 4 months ago. Why are we maintaining this?
Now, when you're showing me that that infinite loop there, and that symbolizing DevOps, and and the data coming into that iterative cycle, a lot of people who are using data have not historically had that background with DevOps. So how do you help them? How do you work with them? How do you increase the development speed if you have people who are needing really to understand, first of all, the principles of DevOps themselves?
So one bite at a time, right? We don't need to go from 0 to totally there at once. I think it starts with okay, we're going to set up some Git workflows. Okay, we're going to set up some peer review. Okay, we're going to add CI/CD testing to our source control. our code repository. And so slowly, the same way a team would adopt DevOps, you slowly add one more stage of that workflow into what you're doing, and you'll feel a lot of pain points. When you add new testing, you're going to find some testing you need to fix, some quality problems, right? I see Dina laughing because I'm sure she knows exactly what I'm talking about. And so you find that problem, you solve that problem, and then you get a little bit further down the workflow. And slowly but surely, you'll build up what gets you closer to a DataOps practice.
Yeah, to add on to that too, I would say hopefully as you're adding in those small pieces, people are then starting to realize the value they provide, right? And to Emilie's point too, like when you're adopting CI/CD and DevOps, there might be some more pain up front, maybe more time and whatnot that you have to put into things, but hopefully long term you see the good benefits of doing that.
Yeah, I think if we appeal to the fact that data analysts do not want to pull the same metric every single month, when you start to give people the tools and ideas that allow them to do more of like the strategic thinking that data people are really interested in, they will see the benefit of the DevOps principles and move in that direction.
Data research is a field that often requires that. Like the analysis leads to more analysis, and you need to start even talking to people and finding out, you know, the answers to your problems, and maybe even the data doesn't show. Do you find that in your work? We find that actually in ours when we do data research. We find we get to a certain point with like a chart, for instance, we're thinking, well, this chart speaks to this, but there's also this subset of data that speaks to the chart, but there's a kind of a disconnect because you can speculate, but you can't necessarily make the clear-cut analysis.
So I have a framework that I like to use for thinking about this. And I have a blog post on the GitLab blog about this, but the general idea is that like there are 3 layers to the kinds of questions. This is simplistic, but there are generally 3 kinds of questions, 3 layers to the questions. The first is what I like to call reporting. That's this bottom layer. And that's like, how many users visited our website yesterday? These are like pretty cut and dry facts. And I like to think of these as toll paying. A lot of times your reporting is about matching a third-party system and making sure your numbers are accurate, that they look like they should look like. So a lot of data quality problems are caught at this reporting level. And then the next level is what I call insights. And insights are kind of what you're getting at, Alex, which is like, hey, we know how many new users showed up, but there was a big spike. And we want to know, will those users stick around? Where did they come from? What, you know, it's about enriching whatever the reporting metric was. And a lot of times insights will come from multiple data sources. So while reporting is something you could just pull from one system, insights are where your data team starts to really add value because they're working across multiple systems. And then the third is what I like to call predictions, but in a very simplistic way. I ran out of room for the IONS, but predictions aren't about machine learning or algorithms or anticipating. It's pretty straightforward data analysis where you say like, hey, we have this chart. It looks like this. If we were to keep drawing this line forward, like what would it look like? And then the idea is the next phase after predictions is actually going to come back to reporting because you're going to want to report how you did against your predictions. And this becomes this cycle that kind of helps the business develop into asking really good questions. At some point, your reporting questions, they exist. You don't need to create them anymore. You don't have to go build a new report to understand what your logging or your new user count looks like. You get to spend your time in this insights and moving up to that predictions question. And that's where, 1, is a lot more fun to be, and 2, you add a lot more value to the business.
And when you go through that cycle, sometimes you find like the signals that you really need to like really answer the questions you don't have but you can get them. And so that you can communicate to the engineering teams, or you can write your own pull request or merge request or whatever it is that your organization calls it. And then you get the signals that you want.
That's really fun. I love that. It helps you answer questions and ask better ones. And there's a lot that applies there to a lot of current thinking that we are noticing and observing in our work when we talk to people about issues such as observability. And it gets into issues such as those unknown unknowns. You don't know what you don't know. And you need to find ways to get to the data so you can find out what are those unknown unknowns. Do you find that, Nicole?
Yeah, so actually, observability is something that has been talked about with my team since we've been running this, these data collection processes for a year. It's actually probably, I would say, a gap right now, is that, we see data changing and it's unexpected. And we don't have a way right now, I would say, that we kind of are monitoring that or have a way to say, okay, why did this happen? What's going on? What caused this? So I would say it's definitely something we see. I don't have the golden answer though yet.
So, Dina, I want to ask you a question about how this applies to the developer experience. How does this apply to, application development overall?
I think that your DataOps team should work really closely with your development team. There should be, in both parties, a good understanding of what the business objectives are and how you would report on those and measure your success, because the capturing the signals that happens in the engineering world, but how you structure it and how you surface it is extremely important. And if you don't capture the right signals, then in a few months from now, when the VP asks how we did on XYZ, going back in time is very difficult. Sometimes possible, but very, very difficult. And it's much better to capture more data than you think you're going to need, and let the analysts parse it out.
Emilie, I wanted to ask you about what you're seeing as lacking in DataOps right now. What is it that are issues that you think could be better resolved with improvements in DataOps techniques, processes, tools, whatever comes? What is the first thing that comes to your mind?
Education and adoption. I think the tools are there. At this point, it's really about evangelizing, helping more organizations come on board with this way of working, and really leveraging the tools that exist. And part of that, I think, is going to be to help level up the people who are working in data as a field. And the best example, for a long time, a data analyst was someone who's really great at Excel. And that leads to the problem that I mentioned earlier, where you have like 12 spreadsheets with like different variations of the same thing, and then one gets edited and it's out of sync with the others. And I think what we need to see is data analysts work in this more collaborative way to solve the things that Dina put really succinctly around reproducibility, around making sure that team members are kind of working on a single source of truth. And in order to do that, that first step in the adoption, I think, is source control management. And what that means is we're going to have to convert all these Excel power users into source code management people. And that means you might have to sit next to them and walk them through Git and teach them, hey, this is what this means, and this is what a merge request looks like, and this is what the workflow is, and this is a branch. And it's something that can seem scary to people, but I've been at GitLab now for over 2 years. I've watched this grow the company by over 1,000 people. And every single GitLab team member has to make a merge request in their first week. And it doesn't matter what your job title is. It doesn't matter what department you work in. I know that it can be learned and taught, and would love to see more people do that. We just have to be willing to put in the work to help teach data analysts and help them get there.
I think we can help with that by leveling up some of like the common tools that people use. Like if you put version control into like the BigQuery GUI, that would be amazing, or SQL Studio or anything like that. There are all of these systems that exist to extract the data, and you write your little query in it, and it exists in its own little self. And so when you do have a version control of a query, you have to like if you want to like run it and test it and see how it does, you have to like copy it over, which is at that point you're hoping that people are going to like be diligent and like have like, you know, good operations, but hope is not a strategy.
I agree, and we see people leverage the GitLab Web IDE, so it's easier. So it's easier to get wrapping and rolling with the GitLab Web IDE than it might be from the command line. And people don't want to set up SSH keys and worry about environments and all that kind of stuff. Well, in that case, we make it easy with the Web IDE as a place to get started. You still have to copy and paste from your query editor, whatever tool you're using, but it removes one hurdle. And I think you said it really well, where it's about removing what's the smallest hurdle we can remove to make it a little bit easier for folks.
So Nicole, when you're working with your colleagues, what are some of the things that you wish you had? What are some of the tools you wish you had? And what are some of the ways you're thinking about, you know, how you could improve your own work? I mean, Northwestern Mutual is an insurance company, and GitLab and Google are technology companies, and this is first on their mind. And so your circumstances are different.
Yeah, definitely thinking about how we can, I guess, unify like our processes and our data collection processes among all these different teams now that have kind of started gathering metrics. So at least in NM, like metrics are the hottest, like the latest thing. So a lot of people want metrics. They want metrics from everywhere. They want all the metrics all the time. So definitely thinking about how can we kind of work together more cohesively, and we're not kind of working in different siloed groups. How can we work together to kind of create a more cohesive, DataOps workflow and process, so that we're not having different teams pull the same data in different ways, so that we have different reports showing different numbers of the same data. Because we have that habit happen sometimes today, and it's obviously very confusing for the app teams. It's confusing at the leadership level to see different aggregated views of things. So we're trying to work out just a more cohesive process to kind of how can we get a more streamlined workflow? How can we ensure that when we're pulling data that's shared data, really when many teams want to access it, how can we make sure like that business logic is accounted for before teams are pulling it, so they're not doing their own business logic on top of it and changing the data in ways that it's not meant to be. So we're really looking at trying to create a more cohesive like workflow between many different teams in the area that I work in.
So would you say there's a need for that, for ways to make those workflows more cohesive?
Yeah, definitely a need to reduce like the duplication of data collection, and then also reduce like people grabbing the data and then manipulating it different ways and showing it in different ways. So we're trying to kind of work out like who owns the data, what's the primary source, how do you access it, how do we make sure that when you're pulling it from the correct place and it has the correct logic already applied to it, so that you don't have to do extra logic in the SQL or whatever when you're pulling it on your end. So definitely trying to work through a more cohesive workflow that spans many teams in the area.
All right, well, let's finish up quickly. So Emilie, what would you say is next for DataOps? What do you see on the horizon coming?
I think if we think of the data stack, we've seen these really great software development best practices be adopted in the ELT process, the data ingestion process, and the transformation process. And I think the next piece is the BI layer is going to really start to develop. I think that's the problem to be solved, is how do we bring these software development best practices where you're using things like merge requests against your BI layer? And it's particularly tricky because your BI layer is made up of more than just the SQL that underlies your BI layer. It's also like an analysis with which has visuals associated with it. And a couple of the players in this space have tried to get a workflow here, but I don't think any of them have cracked the code yet. And I think that's the next problem to be solved. And I'm really excited to see what the solution looks like.
So Dina, just in conclusion, you can, so to finish us up here, what do you see as next? And, we haven't even touched on machine learning.
Well, then maybe I'll say machine learning is next. I think a really cool thing that we can do and probably should do is unsupervised machine learning on our tables. So we have all of these tests, right? That we know the data is supposed to look a certain way. There are certain things that we know to be true. If you're looking at a log of events that happen, we know that the table should have more rows today than it had yesterday, for instance. We know that the stuff in this column should always be of value A, B, or C. But when you're looking at your data en masse, and especially when you're looking at user data, stuff that people and different systems and new systems and systems that you don't have any control over are creating, how do you identify when something goes wrong, when there's an anomaly? And I think unsupervised learning would be a really great way of understanding that our data usually looks like X, and suddenly there is this part of it that looks like Y. And that would be a very useful thing to do.
Well, I want to thank you all for taking the time to talk today. I really enjoyed the conversation about DataOps. And there's so much to explore here, especially when you think about it in terms of its context with DevOps. And the versioning of data, I think, can lead to some pretty interesting conversations, which we touched on here, but I look forward to exploring more in future discussions on the topic. So Dina Graves Portman, Developer Relations Engineer at Google, thank you so much for joining us. Emilie Schario, Internal Strategy Consultant for Data at GitLab. Thank you very much, Emilie, for joining us. And Nicole Schultz, Assistant Director of Engineering at Northwestern Mutual. Thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
GitLab is a single application for the entire software development lifecycle. From project planning and source code management to CI/CD, monitoring, and security, GitLab helps enterprises deliver software to market at new speeds.